in the late 19th century, as the urban environment began to become more developed and industrialization was really taking over the United States, there was a counter reaction in the rural areas. And this is interesting because if you look at where the core of the Trump demographic is today, rural America is really one of the core uh, uh, areas of support for Trump. And so when we're looking at the urban-rural split, it begins obviously with the development of large urban areas in the 19th century, and it continues into the 20th century. And this cultural divide, I think if you look at it carefully, you'll see that it continues to today. So the populist movement, as it was called, begins in the 1880s, and this happens as mechanization occurs and you begin to have the development of the combine harvester, which are those big things that mill grain and harvest large crops mechanically, obviously led to a decline in agricultural prices. So you had large farms making money, but small farmers losing money. And so as prices declined, there was also there were a number of environmental issues. Drought became an issue, particularly in the area around Kansas and Oklahoma, the middle of the country. And the other interesting thing is that the old frontier was not fenced, and particularly barbed wire makes a huge difference because you can put large amounts of barbed wire fence. You can lay it out relatively cheaply, and you can close land in, and that's what the large ranching areas were doing. And so it used to be you could drive your livestock up from Texas up to Chicago, but as the fences go in, you can't do that anymore. So the independent cowboy and the independent farmer begins to lose both land and opportunities to drive cattle. Railroads also are a big piece because the railroads are going to charge a lot of money to deliver goods to market, and of course that increases the price the farmer has to pay to use the railroad. And you can see here on the lower right, the farmers literally being run over by the railway tracks, and that's very much how the farmers in that central part of the United States were feeling. Commercial banking, people felt like the banks were ripping them off, loaning at very high rates of interest, which was true. And then, of course, the emergence of monopolies and people making a lot of money in the urban areas. So because these areas were largely white and had very little diversity, there was a fear of cities as sort of a place where immigration was happening and that the country was basically being taken away from them. So this is going to be tied into the whole, how do you make money available to commoners? So gold versus silver, and silver becomes the currency that farmers want, and gold becomes sort of the currency that is seen as being connected to the industrialist class and the monopolists. So if you look at the Populist Party platform, the idea is where does the virtue come from? Who works hard and makes things so they can be self-sufficient? That's the farmer. So when we connect virtue, which is a moral quality, to farming, we're talking about people who aren't depending on other people to make money. So the banker is a good example of somebody who relies on somebody else's money to make money and isn't really bringing anything productive to the economy as far as the farmers were concerned. So if you look at the populist movement, as the picture on the left would suggest, it really is a socialist movement because, again, capitalism is held up by the traditional religious authorities, by the army, by rich industrialists, and then the people at the bottom are the workers and the farmers. But this was very much a farming movement. So if you look at the populists as they emerge into a party called the Populist Party, they begin to feel like the Republican Party specifically is completely dominated by corporate interests, and they were pretty much right about that. So what they were looking for was basically it's interesting because if you think about the Trump counter reaction to the Democrats, the sort of the elitist Democrats that Trump attacked in 2016, what these people were doing was they were saying, no, we have to allow for more of the wealth production to be distributed. So they really were socialists. They wanted a graduated income tax. That means they wanted people who made more money to be taxed more. They wanted more control of the railroads. They wanted pensions, particularly for people who'd fought in the war. And in that case, that was people who'd fought in the Civil War and later in the Spanish-American War. They wanted shorter work weeks, so they were aligned with the working class in the cities, particularly the white working class. They didn't want private armies, so they didn't want armies coming in and breaking up strikes. They wanted more democracy at a local level. That's what the ballot initiative is. Referendums are basically, the people can put out questions about how governing should happen directly without having to go through the legislatures, which they also thought were dominated by corporate interests. They wanted to have subsidies to farmers. That means that farmers would be paid money if they were producing milk or wheat or things that were important for the country. So basically, they wanted the government to come in and interfere with some of those markets. Direct election of senators and a larger money supply. That's where the silver comes in. So all of these things together were important. And it's interesting that they were looking for a bigger government, more democratic government, and all of those things. So in the bigger picture, it's interesting. There is a kind of a paranoia that develops in this populist way of thinking. And it's interesting because these are people that feel like the world in which they have lived, the agricultural world, is being taken away from them. They were right. That world was disappearing. So that, starting with the second sentence, they view aspects of their world slipping out of their control. They blame a corrupt and alien central government or foreign agents in the body politic. In that case, it was immigrants and bankers, and they wrote literature which basically presented the city as these terrible places where America was being destroyed. So over the years, this paranoid style has targeted witches, the slave power, the railway monopolists, as they did here, the Jewish banking interests, immigrants, communists, a black socialist president. That's Obama, right? That was where all of this began on the Trump counter-reaction. And now under Trump, the media and liberal forces of the government itself. So now the fear is that the government itself, the deep state and all of that kind of rhetoric is the thing that's threatening American liberty. Whereas before, it was more just the capitalist system. So it's interesting. I mean, if you think about America as a capitalist country, these people were beginning to see that capitalism was favoring the wrong type of people as far as they were concerned. So if you look at American politics and you look at who lives where, you see that you have huge numbers of people living in urban areas spread up and down the East Coast, through the Midwest, and then in areas in the West, and then, of course, again, concentrated on the left coast. But in the middle, you see large sweeps of red. Those deep red areas still are primarily rural areas, right? So today's Republicans kind of are the descendants of these populists, right? And they were the Trump voters. So if you look at this, for example, it's a little misleading because you look at this is 2016, Trump Clinton. You'll notice that the New England and the right coast is blue, but that area of the lower South is solidly red, as is the West, and Colorado and Denver, again, has a little bit more blue in it. But this is a more accurate map in terms of actually how it kind of plays out. So what you notice here is you have these urban mega regions that are emerging, and these are urban areas, and these areas, as the other map suggests, have a large majority of Democrats in their voting demographic, which means the people in these areas vote Democratic. But the areas in gray tend to vote Republican. So we have much larger areas of the country which actually support that kind of conservative agenda, but a lot more people in those liberal areas, in those mega regions. So what's interesting here is if you look at where we are here, rural areas, right, overwhelmingly uh, uh, voting Republican, and urban areas overwhelmingly voting Democrat. And so when you look at one of the major splits in America, it's that urban-rural split. It's not just a political split, it's also a cultural split. And I think that's where I want to focus. So when you look at rural America, it's becoming increasingly conservative. If you look at this, scattershot. Now, what's interesting is if you look at white Christianity and white Christians, you'll notice that these areas where you not just rural but also largely Christian, you see large areas of church involvement, and this church involvement obviously revolves around evangelical Protestantism. Which is a more radical form of Protestantism. As if you look at the map on the left, you'll see that runs through basically the Deep South, concentrated in Texas, but all the way through the Deep South and up into the upper Midwest. And then if you look at the other map on the right and you look at the western side of that area around Salt Lake, Utah into Idaho, massive numbers of Mormons who are also very culturally conservative. So if you take those two maps together, you'll see that those rural areas really focus on things like pro-life situations. They're very much against abortion. Abortion is seen as being a byproduct of the urban environment. That good married people and white people in the rural environments don't get them, which of course is a myth, but that's their mythology. They're very much against gay marriage, which they also see as a byproduct of the urban and liberal areas. They're generally against welfare, although it's ironic that the states in which they live usually receive quite a lot of entitlements, at least from the federal government, that's the irony that liberals always point to. But they talk a lot about Christian values, and the Christian values they see are American values. And this was very, very important under Trump. And if you overlap that with this, you see that, again, these are white people, white conservative Christians wanting to protect their country and seeing the slip away from religion being something that is very much sort of the end of America, the end of American values. So this fear of changing views. So if you look at urban culture, obviously urban culture is going to be a lot more multicultural. You're going to have immigrant neighborhoods. Where I live in Watertown, we have a very large Armenian and Italian community here, Latino, Black. That's more of the inner city. Even though Watertown is an ethnic suburb. Anti-prohibition, meaning they believed that alcohol should be readily available, particularly in the immigrant populations. They're politically liberal, which is interesting. So they were progressive back in the early 20th century and still are today, right? Progressive, liberal, primarily Democrats. A lot more class divisions in the urban areas because there are more people making more money. A lot of poor people too, but class divisions, and more independent working women. So there's going to be more feminism and more highly educated women in that urban area. Now, rural culture, again, is dominated, as we just saw, by religion and white Protestantism, particularly evangelical Protestantism and evangelical nationalism, which equates Christianity with the with American identity. They are religiously and culturally conservative, as we just said. They're politically conservative. They voted Democrat back in the early 20th century, and today they vote, as we saw before, almost 80% Republican. They were believers back in the early 20th century in prohibition, which they saw as alcohol coming from the cities and from the immigrants. So prohibition was part of that kind of moral crusade that they were on. Now it's more abortion, which is the issue, anti-abortion politics. And they're traditionalists and remain so, right? Gender roles, it's one of the reasons why a lot of rural areas did not vote for Hillary, because they saw that as not the role that a woman should play. They are against immigration. which is what Trump took advantage of. And they're community oriented, and that there's a little bit more equality. So there is a big urban-rural cultural split in this country, and it begins in the early 20th century.